Ground operations. In this video, we'll cover the ground operations and taxiing from both the lead solo and opposing solo perspectives. The way we in the Legacy Blue solos conduct our ground operations is different than how the real Blue Angels do it, and if you want more clarity onto why that is, we highly suggest watching our Philosophies video that precedes this one. For those of you coming from our other videos, this one's going to take a little bit of a different format because while this is still part of the show and requires a lot of attention to detail, all of it can be covered in the cockpit, so that's what we're going to focus on here. For those of you who are just starting in DCS and are unfamiliar with how to cold start the Hornet, or are not familiarized with the cockpit yet, we've linked a couple of videos below so that you can get a little bit more comfortable in your office. With that out of the way, let's get to the walkthrough. Walkthrough. Welcome to the cockpit of the F-18C Hornet. We've just completed a full cold start and INS setup, as well as entered our waypoints and our radio frequencies for our show, and are ready to go on the ramp. We've just set our first radio to channel preset 3, and our second radio to channel preset 16. While we're talking about radios, let's talk about how we go about communicating a change of radio preset to our section or to the flight as a whole should you have a diamond. Based upon our studies, in Blue Angel's radio parlance, we are currently on tree COM 1, which is that we are on channel preset tree for our first radio, or COM 1. In order to communicate a change of channel preset, we will say chariot switching tree COM 1. Or solos switching tree COM 1. At which point we would switch our radio preset to the number that we stated, which in this case would be tree, so we're not going to be changing that right now. And once we have done that, we wait for a couple of seconds to allow for the rest of our section or the flight to adjust their radios to match ours, and then we would say chariots up on tree COM 1. At which point our section or flight, should they have heard that communication, will also respond with their call sign is up on tree COM 1, which lets me know that they have heard me and that we are in communication. You'll hear this right away, and also as we're turning onto the taxiway and switching to our solo frequency, which is 8 COM 1. After the comm checks, we'll switch into the boss's takeoff checks, which guides the flight to ensure that they have the correct parameters set inside the jet for the demonstration. This will be followed by the Aircraft Maintenance Officer checklist, which my wingman Brother Leb will be reading out as well. Both of these checklists can be found in the description of this video. Alright, enough talking. Let's get started. Chariots up on tree COM 1.
Leb's up tree, come on.
Takeoff checks.
Leb.
Check your smoke pressure on. Check your trim set. Check your heading. My heading. Tree 4-2. Check your altimeter set to 985 for a corrected centerpoint elevation of 0 feet. Check your Baro winding 0. Check your FCS 12, 30, 30, 30, 12. Check your fuel, seat armed, lights out.
Leb.
So now that you've heard Boss's briefing, let's go over what each of those things means, so that you have a little bit more clarity on what you're saying, rather than just repeating a script. Here is the actual kneeboard that I use for this briefing. We'll start at the top. Check your smoke pressure on refers to ensuring that the smoke pressure for the Blue Angel's smoke canister is turned on. We don't have this simulated in our jet because we don't use mods, but we say it anyway just to be a little bit more accurate. Check your trim set means that you have double-checked that you have pressed the takeoff trim button, and you have adjusted your trim to whatever your takeoff parameters are for the demonstration on the FCS page. Check your heading and my heading both go together. Check your heading is asking the pilots to double check their heading tape, and my heading means we're reading off the heading that is indicated for us on the heading tape. This is to ensure that everyone's INS alignment has happened successfully and that they are all aligned to Boss's heading. Check your altimeter set means you're looking down at your altimeter, your barometric altimeter, and you're making sure that the setting is matching Boss's setting. In this show, it is 2985, and then we read off for a corrected centerpoint elevation of 0 feet. That means that at centerpoint on the ground at the airfield, we want the barometric altimeter to be set for 0 feet. This is usually measured by the team and relayed to us in the pre-flight briefing. Set your Baro warning 0 usually refers to the barometric altimeter warning that occurs when descending through 5,000 feet barometric altitude. Making sure that this is set to 0 means that you're not going to be distracted or panic when Betty gives you an altitude call. So it's really important to set that to 0 so that it is not distracting to you as a pilot. Check your FCS means we're looking at our FCS page on our right MFD. That's where I have it personally set. And then we read off our FCS values to ensure that they are correct and they match the rest of the squadron. Some of the pilots, such as the solos, have their FCS set a little bit differently, so they will disregard any values that they know are going to be different, but you want to make sure that in general they're all the same, and this ensures a safe takeoff once we get to the takeoff roll. The next three come in quick succession, and they're just checking a couple of other parameters in the jet. Check your fuel means you're checking your fuel level to make sure it is what was specified in the pre-brief. Check your seat is armed means you're looking at your right hip to make sure that your seat is armed. And then lights out means you're making sure that your lights on your jet are turned off. At this point, the flight would all read off their call signs. In this case, we just have one section member, Brother Leb, our wingman. And then after that, in a real blue show, they would do check your smoke pressure on, smoke off, to double check that the smoke is working on the ground. Due to a long-standing DCS bug, smoke that is displayed on the ground while you are stationary actually hangs around infinitely and can obscure the view of the airshow. So we actually skip this step. But in a real blue show, and should you do any mods that affect the smoke and prevent that from happening, you can do that here. After the smoke check, it's time for AMO's briefing. He reads off the winds as well as barometric pressure settings. He also gives us a squawk code, which we'll talk about shortly, and then also gives us our taxi instructions. It's important to pay attention to all of these things because we're in charge of taxiing, and it will affect our takeoff and flight of the demonstration.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the cockpit of Blue Angel number 6 for this portion of the ground operations and taxi tutorial. Now, we chose to include both the number 5 and number 6 portions of the ground operations and taxi tutorial in the same video because most of the concepts are similar, if not identical, in both jets, and so it made sense to just have them together. Now, this portion of the video is going to cover the ground briefing, which is normally given by the AMO, or the Aircraft Maintenance Officer, who is the highest ranking maintainer on the Blue Angels flight demonstration team and oversees all the maintenance operations, as well as acts as the ground safety officer for the team. His briefing covers important meteorological data, important information related to communications and identification, and also taxi instructions for the team before the air portion of the demonstration begins. His briefing occurs in a scripted sequence, which you'll hear in a minute, but I'm going to cover each portion in detail before you get a full example from a recording we did in an earlier show. So, the briefing begins with a salutation. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever and however you're flying. And then the call sign of whoever is leading the flight. Typically, in a standard demonstration, it will be good afternoon, boss, because they are going to be flying in the afternoon, and the person leading the flight is almost always the number 1 pilot, boss. Then there will be a winds briefing. Updated winds are, and then you're going to give whatever the winds are. If the winds are below 5 miles per hour, it is considered calm winds. You'll just say updated winds are calm. Otherwise, you're going to give both wind direction and airspeed because that will affect different maneuvers in the show, especially low altitude and slow speed maneuvers like the Fortis, the High Alpha, and the Burner 270. Then you will give the meteorological data, specifically barometric data, and you will start with the uncorrected barometric altitude. Then you will give a corrected barometric altitude, so whatever it takes to zero out your altitude indicator down here. Then, after that, you will give the corrected center point elevation, which should be 0 feet. And then the density altitude, which is whatever altitude you are at with an uncorrected barometric pressure. So in this case, it's 59 feet above sea level here in this particular spot. And so that portion of the briefing would go like this. Altimeter is 29902 for a corrected altimeter of 29985 for center point elevation of 0 feet and a density altitude of 59 feet above sea level, or MSL. Then you will give all of the IFF squawk codes for each of the squadron elements. We only have two, so you will just give it for the lead solo and then the opposing solo pilot. And then you will give taxi instructions. You will say that the flight is cleared to taxi, and then you will name each of the taxiways in order until you reach the runway, at which point you will instruct the flight to hold short at the runway for takeoff. So let's hear that from our example show here.
Good afternoon, Chariot. Updated winds are calm. Altimeter is 29902 for a corrected altimeter of 29985 for center point elevation of 0 feet and a density altitude of 59 feet. Chariot, squawk 1205. Leb, squawk 1206. You're cleared to taxi via Sierra to Charlie, crossing runway 07 and holding short runway 07.
So that's what the AMO briefing is going to sound like, and we have the number 6 pilot do it just because we don't have an actual AMO, and we like to include it because it's fun and it's actually helpful, especially like I mentioned earlier, for some of those low altitude, slow speed maneuvers to know what the conditions we're going to be flying in are. If you want to know where to find that information, you will find it on the briefing page, which is part of most missions. Usually you hit right alt Bravo, right alt B, which will bring up the briefing page, which looks like this. And then down at the bottom, you will have all of the information you need. You can see that the wind speed here is 0 meters per second at ground level, so winds are calm. And then it also gives you the uncorrected barometric pressure, 29902. And then we corrected earlier on, as I mentioned, to 29985 for a center point elevation of 0 feet. Back to you, Chariot.
Thanks, Leb. Taxi, cross runway 07, hold short runway 07.
As you heard after we received the taxi instructions, we read back a truncated version of that, which is the instruction to taxi as well as any runway commands. This is to ensure that we taxi safely to our takeoff point. Now, something worth mentioning, because it's not talked about in a lot of tutorials in other places, is the squawk codes, and that's because we're going to be using mode 3 Charlie for our IFF system in order to squawk that command. You saw me put it in there in the CFD, but it's important to go over how to do that, so let's do that now. When looking at the CFD, hit the IFF button at the bottom left. If it remains blank, hit the on-off button to ensure that it turns on. You want the display to read XP. If it reads anything else, hit IFF again until you see XP. At this point, select 3 Charlie, which then should show up with a set of zeros next to XP. At that point, you put in the squawk code provided by AMO and hit enter, and you are now squawking the correct mode. Now that we've gotten our IFF set and our taxi instructions provided and repeated correctly, it's now time to roll. We're going to say, check your parking brake is off. We do this every time that we're going to apply power from stop to ensure that everyone has checked to make sure the parking brake is off so we don't get anyone who stalls on the runway. So we check our parking brake is off, and then we say, adding power up to a certain percentage. This is looking at our engine gauges and looking at the throttle percentages on the left and right engine. And we will say usually powering up to 75% if we're pulling away from stopped and we want to pull away with a decent amount of speed, 72% if we want to be fairly measured, and 70% if we don't want to move at all but we want to have a little bit of power. 70% is often used when detaching Brother Leb from stopped, which we will get to in our next video. So it's going to be check your parking brakes off, and then for this particular instance, we're going to do powering up to 75%, off brakes now. And we do off brakes now in a cadence to make sure that Brother Leb can release the brakes at the same time as us because we're both pulling away to the same direction. So we're going to do a synchronized off brakes, which will become even more important when we do the section takeoff in the next video. So now we're going to be following the taxi instructions as given to us by AMO, which is going to take us left on Sierra, which is the taxiway right in front of us, and then right on Charlie, which will take us across the runway. But when we get to that point, Brother Leb's going to be in lead, so turning right on Charlie is not our responsibility. But we do need to make the left onto Sierra, and so we'll see that now. So let's see how we do.
Check your parker brakes off. Chariot's firing up to 75%. Off brakes now. Chariot's easing power to 70%. And coming left. Give me two on the left wing.
Left.
Alright, a lot just happened there, so let's talk about it. Easing power to 70% means that we are backing the power down to 70% throttle, and this indicates to Brother Leb, our section mate, that we are going to be slowing down a little bit. And then coming left means we're turning left at least 90 degrees, and then we say, give me two on the left wing, which means that we want Brother Leb to move into a parade position in taxi on our left wing. Next up is going to be a comm switch, which we already talked about, and then we're going to detach Brother Leb, which means that he is going to be allowed to pass us on taxi, and then we're going to give him lead as well. We're going to say left lead, which means that he now is the section leader, and he will be giving the calls from that point forward. Let's see how we do.
You got two, Chariot?
Chariot switching 8, comm 1.
Left.
Chariot's up on 8, comm 1.
Leb's up 8, comm 1.
Chariot's easing power idle. Brother Leb detached, left lead.
Leb's attached. Power set 70, lateral. We're easing power idle. Stand by to come right on my mark. Stand by, mark it. Power set 68, let it roll.
You got 2 in trail, Leb.
Leb.
A couple more quick notes. You heard you got 2 Chariot, which is Brother Leb telling me that I have 2 planes in formation, to which my response is my call sign, which is Chariot. Chariot's easing power idle is letting Brother Leb know that I'm easing my throttles back to idle. You heard Brother Leb say power set 70, letting her roll. Letting her roll means we're not going to be touching the throttle for a little bit. So it means letting her roll means I'm going to be fairly stable at this point, so you can make any adjustments you need to get into closer formation in the taxi. Now you heard me say you got 2 in trail, Leb, which means that I didn't hear Brother Leb give a give me 2 in trail call, but I know that that's the formation that we're supposed to be in, so I'm just letting him know that I am where he expects me to be at that given moment by iterating my position relative to him when I get in trail on this right-hand turn. Let's keep rolling.
Runway's clear.
Chariot.
Easing power idle. Stand by for right 180 on my mark. Stand by, mark it.
A little brakes, easy brakes, a little brakes, brakes.
Leb's in.
What you just heard was the taxi braking cadence, and this is separated into 4 parts so that everyone in the section can brake at the same time. This is not super important right now, as Brother Leb's not going to be beside us while we're braking, but it is going to be important when we roll onto the runway for the section takeoff maneuver in the next video. So I won't go over it in detail now, but suffice it to say, it's in 4 parts. A little brakes, meaning we're starting to brake. Easy brakes, meaning we're braking a little bit more. A little more brakes, meaning we're braking quite a bit. And then brakes, with the KS at the end of the word being when we stop. So it's an easy way to do graduated braking so that our section mates can brake with us and so that we can start and stop at exactly the same time in formation. Now back over to Brother Leb, who will take us through the number 6 perspective on taxiing.
Now that we've covered the briefing, lead passes back to number 5, who is the leader of our flight, and we're going to follow him out on the taxi. Chariot will cover all the details of the taxi maneuvering in his portion of the video, but I did want to talk about being a follow in a taxi formation because there are a few minor details that are important to know, and number 6 is most of the time going to be a wingman in the taxi formation instead of the lead. Though there are points, and you will see those in Chariot's video, where the lead passes over to number 6. So we'll talk through that a little bit here. The first thing to know about following when you're taxiing is that you're going to need larger control inputs from the throttle and smaller control inputs from the rudders in order to stay close to lead. That's especially true when you're going to make sharper turns. The more control inputs you put in, the more likely you will over-rotate your nose gear and cause a skid, and then you won't be able to turn at all. This happens to me all the time. It's super embarrassing. Don't do it. So take it easy on those turns. I'm going to pause here and just talk through the taxi as we go along, give you an idea of what to look for. I don't think a whole lot of careful detail and stopping will be necessary. We should just be able to go through the taxi from here all the way to the runway. Real briefly, the taxi at this airfield will be to taxi out, turn left 90 degrees, follow down taxiway Sierra to this first crossing here, which is taxiway Charlie, right in front of that orange and white pylon. Then we will cross across the runway to the opposite side, staying on taxiway Charlie. Then we will make a right-hand 180-degree turn, face back toward the runway, and then we will come line abreast of Chariot, our number 5 pilot, to hold short in front of our runway before we do the run-up, the final pre-flight briefing, and then taxi onto the runway for the show. So let's unpause, and we will talk through what's going on in the taxi. I've already powered up. You can see I oversped Chariot a little bit. I anticipated his roll-off, but I was a little too quick. And now we're just waiting for the call to come left. We don't do it until he says, so even though it feels like it's a little close to this grass, we're just going to wait. And then we're looking to establish ourselves on his right wing because he says give me, or on his left wing rather, because he says give me 2 on the left wing. Extra power to get up, and then a little bit of brakes to get in position, and then you can see the position we want is to have this wing pointing straight at our Hornet bug that we're always looking for our formation maneuvers. This is good taxi position. It's actually surprisingly hard to maintain because of the power demands required. It's very, very minimal, but nevertheless, this is the sight picture you are looking for. Now, once we are in position, we'll switch over to channel 8 on COM 1, and then Chariot will release us. The number 5 pilot will release us. He will detach us, so now that we are lead. We receive lead from him, and then he is going to follow us for the rest of this maneuver. Now we're looking ahead for our taxiway. This is Charlie. We're going to come right on Charlie. We're going to give a radio call, stand by to come right on my mark, then stand by mark, and then we're going to come right. Make it real easy so it's easy for our follow to follow. Then we're going to check and make sure that our speed is consistent and let our follow know what that is. We're going to make sure that our runway is clear before we cross it. And then we're going to warn for the next maneuver that's going to happen, which is a right hand 180. Stand by to come right 180 degrees on my mark. Stand by, mark it. And then I like to wait a little bit before I turn to give Chariot a chance to get rotated so we don't run into him. And then as much rudder as you can give without overdoing the gear, like I mentioned. Little extra juice, and then brakes, brakes, brakes. And we are line abreast, and we are set for our pre-flight briefing before the takeoff maneuver. So that is the taxi from the number 6 perspective. Back to you, Chariot.
That's it for the general overview of our ground operations. Tune in next time to see how we taxi onto the runway and take off as a section. And that's how the Legacy Blue Solos perform our ground operations. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel, where you can find full side-by-side show sequences and debriefs. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the flight line.